Hello students, today we are going to discuss chapter 3 of A Room of One's Own. So here we will be discussing the summary and analysis of this chapter. So after chapter 1 we are coming to chapter 3, and here we find that the narrator returns home disappointed that she hasn't found some nugget of truth with which to explain women's poverty compared to men. She thinks she needs a historian who records facts to describe the condition of women through history, and she considers the Elizabethan period of literature, which is full of well-known men like Shakespeare, but for which account of women's lives are almost non-existent. So here we find that she describes fiction as being connected to life, but as delicately as spider web, and in Shakespeare's case almost impracticability is present there, or it's like impracticable. Now finally, when we analyze this, we find that by turning from fiction, the art of artifice, to history, the art of facts, here the narrator finds that women are just as poor in life as in literature. It is not just that they are missing from the spines of library books as authors, but that they are missing from the books themselves as individual subject. That means they don't have any existence in the book. So here she describes whole history of womanhood, vast as it must be, as a kind of black hole besides the extensive and well documented history of manhood, because women has been throughout non-existent in the past or in history books as well. Now here the narrator goes again to books, this time A History of England, and finds a mere few facts about women over the span of centuries, and these all involve men in some way. Yet women were not lacking in personality, claims the historian. When you look at Shakespeare's play, this is obvious. Cleopatra, Desdemona, all are full of character. A fascinating inconsistency appears in the female sex. So in the imagination, we find the writer is astounded and varied. And here in life and history, she is the property of her husband. I mean, female or women is the property of her husband, and basically invisible. So what one must do to get a real idea of this woman is to consider history and poetry at once. But in the case of the Elizabethan women, there is no history written that will provide this perspective about the females. Now the impression one gets from women from reading Trevelyan's history book is of a creature that only really exists in the realms of marriage and divorce. Now there are legal description of men's right related to their wives, but of women themselves practically there is nothing that we can find in his book as well. And then the narrator conjures the fictional realm where women have a far more colorful, noticeable existence. Here she implies that the real woman of history is somewhere in between these two realms. Now someone needs to, here she says that someone needs to put together a history of women with all the missing facts about what she ate, what she did, and the narrator suggests that a young woman in the audience might try to accomplish it. That means she is referring to the students who are seated there. Now for it is ridiculous even to ask the question about women and fiction in the Elizabethan age without knowing anything about women themselves. Here the narrator exposes her purpose for the lecture by addressing the women in the audience with a call to action. That means someone needs to work. She goads them to do what other women have not done and write a history of women, encouraging them but also placing the pressure of responsibility on their shoulders. And here the writer gives the example of Trevelyan. He is the writer of the history of England, and he claims that most girls were married by 16, and so the narrator can hardly imagine one of them being able to write the plays of Shakespeare. She invents a woman, here like the writer invents a woman, Shakespeare's sister, named Judith Shakespeare, to investigate what would have happened if a woman had Shakespeare's gift. So while William was going to school and hunting, then working as an actor and writer at London Theatre, This equally gifted sister of Shakespeare stayed at home mending clothes and under pressure from her family to marry early, because this was considered to be the job of the females or the women. Now here she's when we analyze, we find that she's trying to say that Judith Shakespeare is a symbol of everything the narrator is trying to describe in the essay. So in Judith's story, the narrator exposes the difference that intellectual and financial freedom makes to creative freedom, and the difference creative freedom makes to poetry. Unlike her brother William, Judith faces a life of wasted talent because she is not getting the opportunity which is given to her brother, or which is obviously enjoyed by her brother. A waste enforced by the very structure and expectations of society, which is to be borne by a female, not by a man. So that's why William Shakespeare is free, but Judith Shakespeare has all the burden and all the responsibility of the household chores on her shoulders. So William's gender gives him many advantages like education, connections, opportunities, resulting in a life that Judith could not or never dream of, and experiences that allow him to further develop this talent. Now here we find that Judith had a loving family. When she is married, she has a loving family and did not want to disappoint her father, so she was forced to secretly stow away to escape her marriage and run away to London. But when she arrived, she was laughed away from the theatre because one actor manager took pity on her and she ended up becoming pregnant by him. So which effectively ended her chances for any kind of writing life, because that is the end which could have been imagined about a female during that time. So Judith committed suicide. This is how the narrator believes the story would have gone or would go. Now when we analyze this, we find that things get worse and worse for Judith as she grows up, and she is forced to abandon her family to follow her desire to write and act. But even having done that, no one will let her act. Finally dejected, she starts a relationship with one of the men who is kind to her. While she is in relationship, or while this relationship does not affect the men, it makes her pregnant, highlighting the intrinsic biological unfairness of love and relationship. That means even that has to be borne by the female. Now society and biology conspires to doom Judith's opportunities so that she never gets the chance to develop her talent, and so she kills herself even as her brother becomes a triumph or a writer. Now when we find it, when we go back to the chapter, it is written that in fact the narrator believes that a woman like Judith, with all Shakespeare's talent, would never have existed, but women must have had a kind of genius of their own. There must have been women, the ones burned for witchery or shunned by their comrades, for example, with potential for writing. So she thinks Anon, that is Anonymous, was probably a woman because she could not write her name because a female writer would not have been accepted. That's why she wrote as Anon or Anonymous. So what is certain, she says, is that any woman born with such a gift would certainly have gone mad or melancholy, and if Judith had survived, her writing would have been twisted and deformed, and she certainly would have disguised herself as Anon or masculinized her name. That means she would have not revealed her real identity as a female. She would have masculinized her name so that she would be accepted as a writer. It is not as natural for women to seek fame as men do. So finally, when we analyze this, we find that the narrator has vividly painted the picture of Judith Shakespeare and gone through the whole journey of her life from birth to suicide. Regretful that she was never able to put pen to paper professionally and remained invisible in history because she never got the chance to write. But though we can regret the lack of fiction that came from Elizabethan women, the narrator argues that even if they had been able to produce works of fiction, they would have been awful pieces of work because they would be deformed by the trails of social obstacles, and she had to overcome in order to become a writer. That means she would not have got that much of freedom as men would have received as a men to write to be a writer. So here the narrator seems to be telling her audiences that women have had to wait for the right time to emerge as a writer. That means they never had the right time to write when they during Elizabethan period. Now here we see that it is obvious that women poets suffered a torn, disturbed state of mind. But how did male writers feel? So here we can say that though we know that Shakespeare's state of mind must have been perfect for poetry, when he sat down to write King Lear, we don't actually know anything about it. We are just analyzing it. We just assume that what would have been his condition when he was writing King Lear or any of his drama. As time has gone on, we have become informed from writers' personal memoirs and diaries, and we learn from his modern confessional trend that production of work of genius was a huge difficult undertaking, and if the writer had any distraction, the work would suffer. And for women, such distraction was so much more prevalent than for men, and the works of genius therefore basically impossible, because a female always has to undergo this sort of distraction, and she has already given such examples, or like a few examples in chapter first, where like her thought is interrupted by outside elements. Sometimes like it's somebody asking her to not to walk on the grass, or like she is distracted often. So like there are other responsibility also which a woman has to bear, due to which she is going to be distracted completely, and obviously she will never be able to produce a good form of writing, or good form, something creative, or something good for the future generation. Now from the snippets of the history that lies behind the major works of literature, the narrator argues that men's lives are uniquely suited to writing works of genius in one critical way. Society was structured in such a way that men could work undisturbed, because all the household chores, all the responsibility of the family was on the shoulders of the female or women. So even though we know very little about women's life, we do not know, or we do know that they must have been fraught with domestic errands and duties and difficulties that meant they were regularly distracted, making it almost impossible to muster the sustained concentration required to write the work of genius. That means to write you need to have, or one needs to have, a lot of concentration, and obviously if there is like whole lot of responsibility over the shoulder of a woman, then obviously she will not be able to concentrate herself to produce something substantial. Now she charges the psychologist of Newnham and Gliddon to find out the effect of discouragement on an artist and how they need to be nourished to be able to write. Certainly many male authors have opinions on the subject. One, Oscar Browning, like whose reference she has given in the chapter, who used to teach at women's college, had the opinion that even the best educated woman was inferior to most men. So now we know that with the benefit of knowing more about the minds and lives of their male authorities, we can see them as more human and not be threatened by their opinion. But 50 years ago, these opinions would have ruled, and obviously that was something which would have stopped a female from coming up or coming out as a writer. Here the narrator argues that in a society where women's inferiority was taken as given, there is of course the natural result that women come to internalize this belief, and that such self-conception of inferiority will naturally affect women's ability to write great literature, because they won't even be able to conceive of themselves as doing so, because they would always consider themselves inferior to the men. So she adds that now that it is clear that much of the male insistence of female inferiority is actually defensive, so that men can continue to feel superior, that such opinions are easier for women to avoid internalizing, but that this is only recently the case. And now here she says that the story of women's emancipation is more complicated than that of full instances of politically minded women shunning their own opinion. And though the young ladies before her before her now enjoyed their rooms and simple dinners, the women of the past cried out in agony. That means they did not have the space, they did not have financial independence, because people of genius have always been most affected by the opinions of others. Now the narrator warns the women that it is not just men that they need to look out for. Though history, women have undermined their own cases by submitting to men, by denying the value of their own opinions, that means being submissive towards the men. So this is especially damaging for an artist, because to create good poetry as Shakespeare did, one must be able to rise above all obstacles and impediments and be incandescent. So the fact that we know nothing about Shakespeare's state of mind is significant evidence of the incandescence. His poetry flows from him free and unimpeded. So here we can say that incandescent is a word that the narrator uses repeatedly throughout the essay to describe the successful poet. It is a magical quality that implies an ability to ascend above the mundane concerns, and in so doing see the world in a clear-eyed universal way, so that the poetry within the poet burn brightly, unwarped by the poet's mundane concern or bitterness and by the hard experiences of the life. So this is all for today's lecture. Thank you all.